YouTube. This video is on how to disassemble a Marzocchi XC400 fork. Now, I got this for a very reasonable €10 deal, and I wanted to fix it because it was €10 because it was basically busted. But the problem was I didn't have any special tool to disassemble it, because I went online, looked at the manual, and the manual calls for at least 4 special tools to disassemble and reassemble this thing. So I took it apart without any special tool, and I thought that, well, maybe I can do a video to show people which maybe could have problems with it, how to do it. So the very first thing you need to do is get rid of, this part, the discard part. It's not very hard. They are held in place by Allen screws, which are torqued in at 1.1 Newton meters, or so the manual says. So when you are putting this thing back together, remember to torque these screws in at 1.1 Newton meters. Once you have removed those, you can put this thing aside, remove the suspension boot, put it aside, and you are going to end up with the 2 legs of it, which are 2 legs of hydropneumatic suspension. So to disassemble it, the very first thing you need to do is actually remove or release the air pressure from it. How you do it? On top you're going to find the air valve covered by this piece. So you unscrew it, put the top aside, press in the air valve and relieve the pressure from it. Now, the next thing the manual says is remove this part. And the way this thing is held in place is by means of a C-locking ring, which sits on top of it and rests inside this groove cut inside of the stanchion. Now, the manual calls for a special tool A, which is essentially a T-shaped tool with basically a nut at the end that you can thread onto the air valve itself, because I don't know if you can make it out, but it's threaded, and you can then push it down and remove the C-ring. But I didn't have it, so I got hold of this nut, which actually I found it in the street, so I don't even know what measure it is. You simply can screw this thing on. You don't need to go all the way. And what you're going to do next is push the air valve down, really 2-3 millimeters, you don't need more, and by means of a screwdriver, a knife, you can pry out the locking ring, and the next thing you're going to do is push this thing out. So that's the very first step, the removal of the air valve. What the manual then wants you to do is remove this part, which is called, well, it's actually the actuating piston of the whole assembly, but the manual calls it the compensating piston. To do that, you need to first push the stanchion all the way down, and that part will rest roughly at 4 centimeters from the top. Now, what you're going to do next is, by using special tool B, which is essentially a hollow tube with 2 teeth machine at the end of it that will engage in these 2 notches, you are actually able to get a hold of this thing and, inserting a screwdriver through it, remove the screw. Now, I didn't have that tool, so what I ended up doing was using a flathead screwdriver, and this all happened inside of the stanchion. You push it in one of the notches, and you have just enough room to put another screwdriver inside and remove the screw. Now, once you have removed that screw right there, which by the way has O-ring at the bottom of it, you are going to insert either a very long M6 screw or a M6 threaded bar, and you are going to thread it inside in place of the screw and remove this thing. But what if you don't have those? Well, what I did was I used metal steel wire wrapped around the screw, put the screw back in and pull this thing out. You can use also, I don't know, maybe fishing line or a very stiff sewing thread. Basically anything that can be wrapped around the screw and that will allow you to push this thing out. Once you have done it, you can empty the oil from the assembly, and you are then able to move on. Now the next part is the removing of the boss assembly. So the next thing you're going to do is remove the dust seal, simply pry it out, then you can unscrew the boss assembly. You are probably going to need either a specific tool, which is sort of a branch, or well, anything that will allow you to get a hold of this thing and screw it. You can then remove it, remove the extension, set it aside, and inside of this you are going to find this, which the manual calls dampener, with its washer at the end. Now, if you lose this washer, remember to replace it with either a Teflon one or an aluminum one. You do not want steel at the bottom, because otherwise you are going to risk galvanic corrosion. So this is an aluminum washer. How do you remove this thing? Is using either the old special tool B, you torque in these two notches here and unscrew it, or, since I didn't have it, I found out that this part, which I think anyone which is interested in bike will recognize as I think it's in English, is the bike post. Well, it's the bike post upper plate. This will allow you to get inside those two notches, and also is just the right dimension to actually not interfere with the leg. So you put that thing in these two notches, then by using pair of pliers you get a hold of it and unscrew this thing and take it out. Once you have done it, you can then start servicing the boss assembly and the extension. Now, the manuals say generally you have a problem with this, get rid of them, but since these are more than 20 years old, it's no longer a viable option. So how do you service the extension? Well, at the bottom here there is this assembly, which is essentially a sleeve, a spring-loaded sleeve. Now, how do you remove it, clean it? Well, at the top of it there is an O-ring. You remove it, put it aside, and this assembly is something like that. This sleeve, on top of it there is a spring, and on top of it there is this locking ring held in place by another of those C-rings. Okay, so camera stop. So how to take this thing apart? You can either push this thing down and expose the locking ring, pry it out with a screwdriver, a knife, and then push this thing, pull this thing out. Or, like in my case, this was clogged with essentially sort of a mud. I couldn't get this thing down, so what I ended up doing was pry this thing upwards, then remove the locking ring, and then this thing will simply slide off. A note on when you are then putting this thing back together, there is a couple of things you have to remember. First, the sleeve. This is not a cylindrical one. If you look inside, and I don't know if you can, half of it is cylindrical and half of it is conical. The conical part goes at the bottom, and on the locking ring you are going, well, essentially, if you can see, but not picking up, so, well, essentially there are, it's not machined in the same way. There is a thicker part which goes at the bottom, and the thinnest material goes at the top. That's because you want all the force is coming up from below, so you want the thickest part to take the strain. The way this thing goes back together, it's actually simpler than the disassembly. And what you need to do is, you put the sleeve on, you put the spring, you do, better to do with this one, you put the sleeve on, conical part at the bottom, put the spring, either way, there is no difference, put this thing with the thickest part at the bottom, you push all the way down, and then you have just enough space to get the locking ring inside. Once you have done it, you take this thing and pry it back into position. Just don't let it come up because it's not enough. You just have to force it into position so that the C-ring engages also with the groove inside this little ring. Now, once I've done it, what's left? Okay, the boss assembly. Now this is essentially the assembly for the upper bearing, the oil ring and the oil ring. How do you remove them? Okay, the manuals call for first, let me show you how they are actually in position. Now you have this washer, on top of it the oil seal, which is, and everything is held in place by this sagger, which sits on top of them and rides in this groove. There is the lower groove is the one for the sagger. The way this thing is machined, you don't need a special tool for these rings, but you actually need just a flathead screwdriver. Insert here, and you can actually pry this thing out. Then what the manual says is, by means of a flathead screwdriver, pry this thing out. They don't tell you from where, how, or anything else. Now, if you're lucky and these things are not in place, have not been in place for long, you came from below, and you will be able to push this thing out. I tried 2 days on mine, and there was no way I could do it. So, if you have trouble doing it, drop them in boiling water. I put this thing for 10 minutes in boiling water, and then with actually a blunter flathead screwdriver, I push this thing out in 30 seconds. So if you have troubles with them, boil them. Also, I don't need to replace the bearing sleeve, but if you need, God help you, because this is pressed in place, and it's essentially the same thing. You just need a screwdriver to get beneath it and push this thing out. Then I could probably tell you about the reassembly. You obviously need something to press an oil seal back on. It could be either some wooden thing, or just don't use something metal that can cut it. Well, basically that's it. Now, to put this thing back on, you obviously take the leg, put the dampener at the bottom. The very important part is the sequence of how you put it back together. So you have this, you put this thing back on, put the extension back inside. At the bottom of it, put the boss assembly with also the dust seal on, and then when this thing is at the bottom, you fill this thing with oil. The manual says when this thing is all the way to the bottom, they don't give you a volumetric quantity or weight quantity. They just tell you with extension all the way to the bottom, fill the shock until the oil is at 4 centimeters from the top. You can go as far as 35 millimeters, but nothing more, they say. Obviously, the more oil you have, and essentially the less the fork will go down. So if the risk of putting, let's say, the oil at 6 centimeters from the top is that you are going to slam too hard on the shocks while using them. Once you have done it by using, and I have to actually make it, you have to put this thing in a way that this surface is actually resting on top of the oil. So if you are putting it on 4 centimeters from the top, you are going to need to make some tool, which can be, I don't know, a bolt with 2 nuts locked around a very large washer, and let's say that this is 1 centimeter with the screw. You make the washer at 3 centimeters, so in a way that it will be something like a tool like this, let's say, that pushes on top of the compensating piston, and when it's resting on top of the oil, it's something like this. You just probably get the idea of what I'm saying, because otherwise you're going to need the special tool D for this job. But anyway, once you've put this thing back in place, you put the air valve back in place, put air pressure inside. The manual says at least 3.5 atmospheres, and you are done. So this is basically what you need to know for disassembly and reassembly of this fork.